Thank you, Jim. And just to extend a welcome to Burkhak and to Katia, thank you very much for joining us here today. So I was asked to give a little bit of information about the launch that Jim mentioned, the launch that we did yesterday that really began a new phase of work in the UK around community resilience and how communities will play a very important role in the coming climate emergencies that we hope to avoid in the UK. So this is a consortium, a national consortium for societal resilience that sits across the UK. It involves about 60 partners. Most of those partners are local government, and local government want to come together to develop new ways of engaging communities in building their own resilience. So we have 96% of the UK's public are covered by the local governments that are involved in this initiative. We have England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales represented. We have Channel Islands represented, islands around the mainland. And what we're trying to do is understand how can we enhance the resilience of our communities? How can we provide them with the tools, the techniques that they need to be able to build their own resilience? And we're doing this in a number of ways. One is through working with local government so that they can provide support to communities. Another is working through sector partners. So sector partners like large voluntary sector organisations, through business networks and major sort of associations, people like this Federation of Small Businesses, the Business in the Community, as well as working very closely with other parts of government that don't normally get involved in resilience. So things like children, young people, families, looking at the way in which our green spaces are being used, and looking at and planning and all sorts of different aspects of local government and the activities that are contained therein. So this is a new initiative for the UK. And Jim just asked me to provide a little bit of background as to what we were doing around that. Jim also asked me to talk a little bit about what it is that and how this has relevance into the sort of building a local resilience. In the university, we've been talking a lot about the need to build capability in our communities. What that means is enabling the communities to be able to respond to a major incident, a major emergency if it happens. We see flooding happen in the UK. One of the highest risks on our national risk register is major coastal flooding. And obviously that has a significant impact on some of the lives across the country, but also that will be affected by climate and changes in our climate. I guess I should also mention, just as a last point, Jim, is that yesterday was the International Day of Disaster Risk Reduction. And that really, an annual day, 13th of October, when we remind ourselves that we are very vulnerable to disaster risks. And as a result, we've got to take action to address those risks. And we do that as an international community. And I know that Burkhak does a lot of work with the United Nations. It is an opportunity for us to come together to share understanding, share learning, as well as to celebrate what has been done and to remind ourselves that more needs to be done constantly. So maybe that's a good time for me to pause and to maybe just to hand back, and maybe we can get to some of the questions. You're on mute, Jim.
Apologies. Thanks, Duncan. So yes, I think the first sort of question we'd like to put to Katia and Burkhak is how we involve the whole society in response to climate change. So do we think it's right, first of all, that the whole of society should be involved in these decisions rather than just governments and official agencies, etc.? So perhaps, what are your thoughts there, both on let's start with Katia. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks. Yeah, so unequivocally, yes, all of society, all of community should be involved in this work. I think, for Vancouver in our context, Vancouver was the first city in Canada to have a climate adaptation strategy. We have been listed as one of the greenest cities in the world for many years. But that action wasn't big enough or bold enough, I think, for the crisis that we're facing. And where we've seen big shifts and big changes is people taking to the streets and marching, and in particular, youth and Indigenous communities demanding change, demanding action at bigger scales, demanding more transformation of how we do things, what we do, that has led to our city declaring a climate emergency, releasing a climate emergency action plan, and really accelerating a lot of the work that was kind of underway already, but not getting as much traction as we needed. And one thing I think, or I hope, I guess, is really clear is that governments get their mandate, at least in Vancouver, where I'm from, in Canada, from community. Community members, residents, constituents vote for elected officials, and those elected officials are supposed to represent you. And so I think one thing that we see is kind of a lot of activation around election time, but we need that activation to continue throughout the year, to hold people accountable, to hold governments accountable, to committing to those actions and doing the hard things that we know we need to do. And in addition to that, I think there's also another piece to how we empower and support community in getting involved in this work. And I'll kind of provide an example. So in Vancouver, much of our sort of GHG emissions comes from things like transportation. It doesn't so much come from electricity and power, because our electricity comes from hydroelectric, so quote unquote clean energy. And so what we've seen happen in the past is community members expressing a real interest in climate action. And I'm giving examples from a few years ago where community members approached government and they really wanted to put solar panels on the roof of their building. And it was a group of people who wanted to do this. And at the time, the message was, well, that's actually not going to make much of a difference on climate change, so don't bother. That's the message that came back from government. And unfortunately, what that means when we say no is that it shuts people down. It shuts people down who were enthusiastic, who were ready, who were committed. It shuts people down who are passionate. And once we do that, it's almost impossible to get those people back to the table. So the approach that we really need to take is saying yes and that comes from improv, actually, as a practice of saying yes and. When we do that, we open the door, we empower people to take action. It doesn't really matter that it's not the exact big, bold action that we in the policy world want to see, because by opening that door, you actually allow that community to get excited about something, and you can pretty easily direct them onto the next thing that will be bigger and bolder. So yes, do that, put solar panels on a roof, and then do this. I'll stop there.
A resounding yes to the answer to that question there from Katia. Thank you. But Bershak, do you agree?
Hi, thank you. Yes, thank you. My answer is also a definite yes. And how do we involve them? So from my academic, I have several hats. From my academician point of view, I believe in education. So I think early childhood education should be one of the key points to increase public awareness against climate risks, because we all our ultimate aim of all this work is to contribute to sustainable development, right, for future generations, for our kids, for our grandchildren, etc. So I believe in early childhood education should be really strengthened and enhanced with the idea of the climate change, like just teaching them very simple techniques, like if it's too warm, have some light clothes. If it's too cold, put on warm clothes. Even this little things to do, I think, make the difference in a human life in the long run. Social media, youngsters especially, the Generation Z that people call, I think social media is quick and fast way to get into people's mind about climate change and the surrounding risks and things related with the weather events, etc. So from my disaster risk management point of view, I believe everything needs to be community-based. If you want to build resilience, it needs to be built on the community. Otherwise, we can't achieve any success, and it won't be a good way to do it. From an example from Ankara, Ankara is the capital city of Turkey, but there's a problem here because like it is a city with like 5 million inhabitants, but with the number of the cars registered, it's the highest number, even more than Istanbul, because I know in some families, every household has their own car, and the public transportation is not common there, and it really creates a lot of mass air pollution, traffic jam, congestion, everything that every household, son, daughter, mother, father, everyone has their own car. I'm not a fan of that idea. So I'm trying to impose to society that this should not be done that way. And from my Ankara City Council working group lead, there's a separate climate change action group in the Ankara City Council. And the function of this Ankara City Council is to provide and suggest regulations to Ankara Metropolitan Municipality. In disaster risk management studies, because Ankara is the capital, the system in Turkey is Ankara takes the lead, becomes an example for other cities as well, including Istanbul. So every political idea or every policy statement, it starts in Ankara first and then spreads to the other cities in Turkey. So Ankara City Council is really giving a lot of importance to climate change, taking action and preparing documentation that can be used for the whole community. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Duncan, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm hearing from both Burkak and Katia is that we need to get the public excited about something. They need to be really motivated about that. And I really like how Katia talked about that in a positive way. Get them excited about doing something positive, because very often I think in disaster risk reduction, we talk about them getting excited about something that's quite negative, getting them excited about a risk, and that risk is potentially a life-threatening sort of experience. And so I'm just keen to hear from Burkak and Katia, how do we get them excited about something positive without perhaps getting them too concerned about something that is incredibly negative? I just wondered if you had any thoughts, Burkak.
Yeah, I think if we target the youngsters on this, the university students maybe, and if we can show them the good examples where there was a change, an example from UK, an example from Japan, an example from I don't know any country, which can really show the before and after. I think before and after comparison, that would be great, and they can believe it.
I see that with my own children, and they come back home and they have such, terrific stories. And one other thing that we've been seeing elsewhere is getting the youth involved. So, older teenagers going into early 20s, getting them involved and really getting them involved in some really as activists. Katia, I see you nodding.
Yeah, so I'll share an example of one action that one of our community partners took. They hosted a Hunger Games themed, I don't know how to call it, event for youth, for young people kind of ages 11 through 13. They set up a bunch of challenges that were related to the books, the Hunger Games, about, finding food on this massive kind of community center property in their community garden, solving a communication challenge, setting up a shelter, collecting water from a stream. But they also gave them points for working together and collaborating. And I think that was a really great way to engage these youth in, how can we make this fun? How can we talk about these really scary, hard things, about crises, and make sure that it's kind of gamified so it's not quite so terrifying. And then the other thing I'll put in a plug for is working with artists. That's a great way to get people excited, and also to allow people to process some of the climate grief they might be feeling as well. Artists have a very unique ability to tell stories and bring people together and make people feel closer and connected. And I think that's a lot of what we need right now to make people feel hopeful.
That's an interesting term you've used, climate grief.
Yeah.
I wonder if you,
I was going to say, yeah, explain more what that.
Sure. I think it's becoming a pretty commonly used term here, but we found lots of folks, community members and otherwise, have expressed sort of a sense of loss and dread when they hear about, species collapse, or they hear about what the future is going to look like for their grandchildren or their children or even themselves. They're really experiencing kind of profound loss and grief that's associated with that. And they don't have an outlet for it a lot of the time. It's sort of intangible in many ways because you're grieving something that in some cases hasn't happened yet. So, many of our community partners have expressed that that's something that they want to tackle and work on. And we haven't necessarily as a city, as a government, figured out how to do that, but there are many artist groups that are starting to kind of tackle that specifically as a social impact of climate change.
Okay, let's bring it back now to some extreme weather events. So it's very, very timely we have Katia on this call because of what happened this summer in British Columbia, Katia, and the extreme weather temperatures you experienced. One question we wanted to put to you both was the issues you've experienced in your cities and regions around extreme weather events, and also how you've actually, your offices have dealt with the challenge. And I'd be really interested, I'm sure we'll all be interested to hear about some of that, Katia, and how you handle those temperatures.
Yeah. So the heat dome event that you're referring to from June of this year was, according to some climate models, a 1 in 1,000 year event. And we're expecting that to change pretty dramatically in the next 30 years. So this is the future that we're looking at. It's arriving today. We saw 570 people, according to our coroner's report, died during this heat event. And the response that we had to that was pretty standard to heat waves we've had in the past, which were nowhere near as significant. So spray parks, establishing cooling centers, asking community partners to do wellness checks on people and kind of door to door or by phone to make sure folks were okay. So we had some response kind of planning and mechanisms in place, but the scope and scale of the event was kind of above and beyond what we were anticipating. So, we've come out of that event with lots of learnings. We've come out of that event with lots of community partners who actually want to work quite closely with the city on what this is going to look like in the future and how we're going to work together, who does what. But truly a pretty tragic event to kind of have those learnings through. And I think it also, in some ways, that heat dome event really kind of reinvigorated the climate change conversation that COVID had sort of pushed to the side for quite a while. So, our community members are very much re-engaged in wanting to see climate action coming out of COVID, wanting to see that be part of the recovery planning process, or recovery plan at, not just the local Vancouver scale, but across the country. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, you definitely answered the question. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Burchak, have you experienced similar sort of extreme weather events in recent times?
Yes. This summer was devastating. So we never experienced this. This was the most devastating forest fire since the establishment of the Republic. So like past 8 years, 9 years, 95 years. So the largest, the Turkish Riviera from west to east, like the largest area had been burnt down. So the capacity, there was a lack of capacity. That was what we learned from those. There was a lack of communication, lack of capacity, but there was lots of motivation from the firefighters. So they had to, they work like shiftless. They work in one location to put a fire, then travel to another one, and volunteers. So both the government employees, local government employees, and the community. So volunteers on both sides. So they work really like really very humanly, with until their last breath, until their last power. So everybody worked like so much dedicated to put off the fire. And then afterwards, there was floods in the Black Sea region, which is the province is called Barton. And that was not new to the community because back in 1992, there was another big devastating flood in the region 20 years back afterwards, and it repeated itself again, and there are lots of casualties, and still people who are unaccounted for, most probably swept into the Black Sea. So we had the wildfire, we had the flood, the flamingos died. Maybe you heard it in the news. I don't know if in the UK or not. There's a lake called Salt Lake in mid-Anatolia, and this is the pathway for the flamingos when they travel, migrate. So lots of baby flamingos died because of lack of water. So that first time happened in Turkey. So it was really hurting me when I watched news with the all casualties of flamingos all around the surface of the lake. So fish die due to lack of oxygen. So we really have number-wise and event-wise increasing events in the emergency and climate warning. So a priority, what is the reason? Maybe the reason for the lack of capacity from the maybe government employees and also on the communities, it is not the priority in the list. I think economic situation and economics comes the first in Turkey as a society-wise. The climate change action is not in the first thing to do in their list in people's mind. I think this is one of the reasons why we have lack of capacity. Thank you.
Thanks, Duncan. Do you want to come in on obviously both countries have both seen, really extreme events in recent times?
I noticed that we're mostly talking about heat-related events, and recognise that in Canada they have some extreme cold temperatures as well, and that I'm interested to know whether the sorts of planning that you have to do for some of those heat dome events, or indeed the Burkak's talked about around forest fires, whether that similar sort of planning gets done for those very cold weather events, especially when you're looking for missing people, when you're trying to support people in their homes. I recognise that. I think another thing that I'm quite interested in is whether communities come together during these events. So during some of the events that Burkak mentioned, do the communities come together during those emergencies? In the UK, we've recently, I won't call it an emergency, but we've recently had a lack of fuel, a lack of petrol for infilling stations for vehicles. And what we've seen is in the almost the immediate aftermath of our communities coming together during COVID, we've seen our communities almost becoming very pulled apart. We've seen fights on petrol forecourts. We've seen some terrible scenes. Really seeing that some disasters, some emergencies are bringing our community together, and other types of events are straining them and pulling them even further apart.
Do you want to come in on that, Katia or Burchak, at all? Or not? Katia's nodding. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So on the first question about do we kind of use some of the same concepts for both cold and heat? Vancouver is a very mild climate, so it's quite rare for us to get snow, maybe a couple of days a year, and quite rare for it to drop below 1 degree Celsius. So quite mild here compared to the rest of Canada. But yes, in the past when we have had cold snaps, I believe 2017 was a pretty major one that lasted for a few weeks. We used many of the same things. We had warming centers set up. We were talking with community partners about wellness checks and phone trees and things like that. We were trying to find ways primarily for folks who are unhoused to get shelter and to be able to be inside, because being outside, that was the kind of key exposure we were seeing. So we have used some of the same kind of mechanisms in the past for both heat and cold, and that is helpful to think about. In terms of your second question around events where community kind of comes together or is torn apart, I mean, I think we certainly saw at the beginning of COVID, there was like pretty significant uptick in community cohesion. People were banging pots. And for me, that was the telltale, like when community stops banging pots for healthcare workers at 7 p.m. every night, that's when I know that things are kind of going to a bit of a darker place. And it was around that time where we started seeing a rise in anti-Asian violence, in community members just not listening to kind of the healthcare sector's guidance on protocols and restrictions anymore. So I think, we do see some of that pulling apart as the event goes on for a longer period of time. I think that's actually a real key and something that we really have to think about in terms of COVID, or in terms of climate change and how that will play out. The difference between these quite short acute events that see great community cohesion and then things going on for a long time, and needing to infuse our work with a lot more of that kind of hopefulness and connection building as a result. We want to keep that going. We want to make sure we foster that. So we need to do it at really critical moments during these sorts of crises. And then, I'll just raise not a climate impact, but we did have an oil spill in Vancouver several years ago. And we almost couldn't handle the number of people that showed up at the beach wanting to clean off rocks and to help clean the beach and to find animals and help them. So I think, despite some tensions that we see when people's access to previously abundant resources is becoming limited, we mostly see that during these acute shocks that people do come together, they do want to help, they want to make a positive difference, and they can build a lot of great social connections through those processes.
Yeah. Thanks, Katia. Yeah. Just before we move on to Burchak, I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Ruth, who's going to deal with the other questions that come in the chat. So she'll come in with the various questions that have already come in, which is great to see. Do keep them coming in, and she'll ask them over the next half an hour or so. So over to Burchak to answer that question.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think it's the human mind, and it works same everywhere in the world. If it is good for the whole community, people can come together and stick together and work together. But if there is anything that you will personally have for yourself or for your family in case of a scarcity of food, water, petrol, whatsoever, then you think of yourself automatically first, and you can be aggressive. I think I'm not, but some people can be aggressive. So I think that's the human psychology, which should connect with sociology and find some action to solve for climate change. Thank you.
I think that's another great point of, and it stretches back to something that Katia mentioned of during such emergencies. One of the important things is to establish new partners, but very much working with existing partners that you already know how to work with. And I think, Katia, you talked about these warming centres, and clearly, or indeed cooling centres, depending on. Clearly, these are very well organised initiatives. Burkhak, I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about some of the preparations that local government or maybe in Ankara have made to working with communities. So how can those communities be involved, not just as passive respondent or passive victims, but how can they get involved? And then maybe we'll come to Katia with the same question.
Okay, thank you. What they do, they connect with NGOs. This is the first time I've seen Ankara Metropolitan Municipality, which was really, to be honest, mainly government dominated before. The current mayor, he was elected as the Wedo mayor this year, by the way. So he's really doing a lot of job involving communities, and he's very much connected with the NGOs and listens to them. I think listening to someone is important. It is like 50% of the solution if you read the question. Same thinking. So he listens to people and tries to understand the problem so that he can turn it into policy. So in Ankara City Council, one of the main reasons to establish such council is to, as I said, to provide suggestions, using the connection with the NGOs, having surveys, getting people's feedback, thoughts, and just using it as a baseline to have decisions at the city council itself, at the metropolitan municipality. So this is why they are getting success, because they do needs assessments by using the NGOs. Thank you.
I think what you really well done there is explain. We can work with NGOs, we can work with communities to understand risks. and to try and understand matters from their perspective. And so listen to them, listen to the problems that they've got. Maybe Katia will be able to comment on that, and also about some of the vulnerabilities that communities have, because communities know their vulnerabilities intimately. And I'm just wondering, Katia, if you've got any thoughts about that risk and vulnerability side, and how communities can work and be supportive of government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think place-based approaches are really important. Even just within different neighborhoods in a city, you're going to see different risk profiles, different vulnerabilities, different challenges. The work that we've done on our Resilient Neighborhoods program was kind of focused on that. So what does it mean to do resilience building work at the community level in different neighborhoods, very fundamentally different neighborhoods across the city? And I think a big finding for us was that, yes, it's important to understand the risks and know kind of what uniqueness there is in the neighborhood around vulnerabilities, but it's also really important to understand what your strengths are in a neighborhood. So taking that capacity-based approach, the asset-based approach, like what's great about your neighborhood that you have access to, that you can use. And another kind of component of that for us was really shifting away from, in the disaster context, talking about what's in your emergency kit and focusing on who's in your kit. Who are your neighbors? Get to know your neighbors, get to know the people in your network. I totally agree with Bershak's point. Engaging with community-based organizations, neighborhood houses, nonprofits, NGOs, allows people kind of a pretty easy point to connect with other folks who might be interested in the same topic. And then getting together and doing something. Again, doesn't have to be preparedness focused, but we like to think that, you know, resilience is ultimately built through collective problem solving, and it's based on trust. So allowing people to get into spaces, positions, facilities, groups where they are able to tackle any kind of problem, build a trusting relationship, build social cohesion, social connection, and get involved, that will ultimately build resilience to any number of hazards that we might face in the future. And then there's also a lot of work that we do need to do to address, to your point, these underlying vulnerabilities. You know, we can't have the same expectations that communities who, you know, don't have financial resources will be able to evacuate their homes when they need to. So we need to actually put systems in place from a government standpoint so that those people can actually get the help they need in the moment and can evacuate. Their financial ability to do so should have nothing to do with it. That's our responsibility as government. And I think that kind of like mixture of place-based, but while recognizing that certain people will have certain needs and we need to plan for kind of the base of those needs as opposed to what sometimes happens, which is like one size fits all, which is one size fits almost none. We need to plan for the folks that need it the most and take more of that equity-based approach.
Absolutely. You've covered a lot there, Katia. And what's going through my mind, Berkak, is that is all really difficult to do. It's really difficult to connect with communities. It's really difficult. I remember listening to somebody and they said, it's not, we shouldn't be using the term hard to reach communities, you know, communities that are there because we know where they are. It's us, it's government, it's researchers, we're hard to reach. I just wonder in Turkey, is it easy to communicate, to connect with communities? Is it a challenge?
Okay, thank you. When you were saying that, I was thinking who connects with the community. So for UK, for example, I'm not a local, so who will connect with the community? I think it's a big question mark because you need to always get a local person to connect with the local community. If I'm a researcher doing a research, say in the Philippines, I can't connect with the community in the Philippines, but I need a local person who can connect with them. So networking is always important, international level. In Turkey, which is good. I think this is one of the good parts of the country of Turkey is there's a very strong social coherence. So everybody knows in their neighborhood. I agree with Katia, neighborhood volunteer system is the best way to approach to local management of disasters, climate change, resilience, whatsoever. So there is a system called Muhtar. Muhtar is the elected representative of the Muhtar, M-U-H-T-A-R, Muhtar. So same system in Indonesia. It works in, I think, Pakistan as well. So the neighborhood people select a representative of their locality. So that person has access to the community very easily. Also in Turkey, the Turkish Red Crescent used this system in the previous disaster risk management projects. The teachers, especially at remote villages, they are very handed to access to community, and medical doctors. The doctors, muhtars, teachers, and also the religious people. Imam in Turkey is the name, and they can, like priests in the other systems, so they can access the community faster than I do, for example, as a researcher. So always you need to have someone as a facilitator. Thank you.
So Duncan, I've got a couple of questions if you want me to jump in.
Yes, please. Thank you, Ruth.
Yeah, so we've got a question from Cecilia. So she's interested to hear if you have successful cases of bringing private capital to invest in nature-based projects. So it's not all depending on public capital, and it found a way to unlock revenue streams from nature-based capital for private investors, or if you're somewhere in the way towards it.
Thank you. Is Cecilia able to come off mute?
I can see if she wants to.
If she would like to, then it'd be great to hear from Cecilia, and she could pose her question to our expert speakers.
Oh, it doesn't actually look like she's online anymore.
Oh.
That's a shame. No, I think she's dropped off now by the looks of it.
I think you're right. Private capital to nature-based projects. It's a very specific aspect of disaster risk reduction, of bringing in private financing and looking to see how can you unlock different revenue streams. Of course, Katia, in a city, you've got so many different revenue streams coming into the city, both from national government, from local people. Is private funding, private capital, is that an important part of your funding mix, or does it sit somewhere on the edges?
To be honest, I don't have a great response to this one. Some of my colleagues would be able to answer it a lot more thoroughly. What I will say is I think we're always looking for ways to fund projects as a government. I think a lot of the sort of private investment, private money that we do get in tends to come from developments. So when a major development is going into the city, there's fees that are extracted from that process, or requirements that developer has to potentially, in some cases, put in designs or nature-based solutions within their design. I wish I had more information for you. I don't have any specific examples of where the city of Vancouver at least has been doing this. It's possible we have, though.
It's a very interesting question. Thank you for having a go at that one, Katia. I see that Marek account 3 would like to answer the question live.
No, don't worry. That was just me saying that we've answered that question. Don't worry about that. Okay. We have had another one. It's off anonymous. If you want me to ask that one.
Well, I see that. Sorry, Ruth.
No, go ahead, Duncan. If you want to.
It was Burkhak. It was around public transport. It was around car-free cities. And from your work across the world, have you seen people trying to rethink transportation, to reimagine how transport could possibly happen? In the UK, what we saw during COVID is obviously far less movement of people, starting to change some road infrastructure into more pedestrian and cycle-friendly, moving people off of public transport where there was potentially or anticipated a greater movement of the virus, more moving them into walking, moving them into places where they could have a constant stream of sort of airflow. I just wondered if that rethinking public transport has been a feature of any of your work, Burkhak.
Yes, thank you. Just before COVID-19, that was going to happen in Turkey because people were very much in favor of public transport. Trams in cities where the location geography is possible was getting enhanced, advertised. So especially with the university cities, if they're in university like Manchester, like especially Ankara, so that was getting popular. The cycling roads like in Holland and the Netherlands and other cities, that was really getting popular, and there was lots of investment in infrastructure to develop such plans for the city plans. Yet when COVID started, people didn't want to use public transport. So now the numbers are dropping. Everybody, that's why everybody pushes to drive their own car to their offices now. So one disaster kicked another one. I can say a biological disaster kicked another physical hazard, but I think it will go back to normal. We are still in favor of using using more public transport and less private transport systems, and having free air, clean air, and no congestion in our cities. If this answers your question, I would like to add one sentence to the previous question on private capital, if you allow me, please. You know, we had the mutilage problem in Istanbul Bosphorus Strait during the summer. There was a heavy mutilage everywhere in the Bosphorus Strait, and the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, Ministry of Urbanization, and private companies like the detergent companies, Unilever, other companies, they funded the metropolitan municipalities to put some kind of I don't know, the equipment in the strait, so which absorbed all the mutilage, and that is how they stopped they try to reduce down the impact of the environmental problem. Thank you.
Thank you again. Katia, I saw you nodding vigorously at many of the transportation issues that Burkhak was discussing. Has that been something in Vancouver that you've been thinking about, changing transportation behaviours?
Yeah, I think we have a pretty strong history of making somewhat bold changes around transportation. One of the resilience stories that we talk about in our strategy is actually the Great Freeway debate in Vancouver, which I believe was in the 1970s, 60s or 70s, where there was supposed to be a kind of Seattle-style freeway that went through the city, and community came out from the neighborhood of Strathcona in droves and fought back against the city's plans to do this. And you know, from there, at that point on, you know, the city has had a pretty strong history of putting in bike lanes, and it's like almost a running joke at this point how much complaining we hear about bike lanes in the city. But we do have a great bike lane network and a lot of active transportation. And through our climate emergency action plan, one of the sections of that plan is called How We Move, and it's predicated on how we need to change our transportation network. So way more active transportation and transit, electrification of vehicles, as well as designing complete communities and neighborhoods so that people don't have to go as far in the city in order to meet their basic needs. So there's a number of kind of fronts on that transportation kind of planning piece that I think we have real interest in. There's lots of work happening on, and unfortunately sometimes it's definitely a very contentious issue in the city. So this is what the earlier conversation we had. We do need people to support that work, to come out in favor of it, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. I'm going to maybe just our last question, looking at time, is thinking about what lessons have you taken from recent emergencies? So what if you were a new government planner coming into emergency planning for the first time, and you were starting to think about where could we make most impact on our disaster risk around climate, what would be your advice we should be doing this, we should be doing even more of this? And I think you've talked a lot about a whole range of different issues, and you know, everything from transportation through to developing new partnerships, through to some public financing and things. But what would you tell this new planner that they should be starting to think about in their cities around climate disaster risk?
Do you want to go first, Katja?
Sure, I can. Sure, I can go. I think one of the biggest pieces of advice I'd offer if you're a planner starting out in this field is sometimes there's a tendency to separate out climate mitigation, climate adaptation, disaster resilience, emergency management, like we're all in different departments. And I would tell that person, do not separate those things. They are mutually reinforcing, they are critical to the success of the other, and that you can actually find some really wonderful co-benefits to actions kind of across that spectrum. And there's also some trade-offs that we need to have hard conversations about. So don't, sit in one of those groups and not talk to the other people in those other groups. I would also say just my only other tidbit is don't shy away from community. Really engage with community partners, get your feet on the ground and talk to residents. We can't be sort of sitting in a tower in the middle of the city, overlooking it and not engaging with the people who live in it. And so get kind of involved in community groups, make sure that your actions or the policies that you're putting forward have a lens from community partners so they can tell you, is this going to work? Is this going to land in our daily experiences? Yeah, those are, I think, the two biggest pieces of advice I have.
That's great, thank you. And Burke.
Hi again. For the climate change, I believe in fast and wise adaptation. So we need to be quick. There's no time to wait, so we can't wait. We need to start immediately, like the next second, to adapt in whatever way we can. And I always believe the history turns into policy. We need to look for the history of the city, the vulnerabilities, to the events which happened there, because the events, as I said in the previous discussion, events change, type of the events change. It was earthquakes in Turkey, which was very popular, and community used to talk about earthquakes. Now we have the sandstorm, we have the thunderstorm, we have the lightning, we have the avalanche, we have COVID, we have the mine disaster, any kind of hazard. So we need to adapt to the changing environment, changing risks, understanding risks. And I think the best way, as Katja also suggested, the best way is to walk around the city all the time, go around the city all the time, do some hazard hunt in a way, see what could happen, what could not happen, expecting to find out the expected and unexpected risks which can occur, because you never say never. And I believe in the keywords also, the sustainability, accountability. We need to always keep in mind that we are accountable to the communities and also the fund donors always. So that's from my point of view.
Thank you both. There's been so much in what we've discussed over the last 45 minutes. I think some key takeaways for me have been that we can focus on risk, we can focus on vulnerability, but we need to focus on resilience. And it's building resilience to those risks, bearing in mind what those vulnerabilities are, that really will help us to be better prepared for what comes next. That we need to work together on what comes next. We can't, as Katja says, sit in our ivory towers. We can't, we've got to get out there, we've got to help each other. And that means that we need partnerships. We need very strong partnerships. We need existing partners, of course, but we need new partnerships with other planners that might be in other departments, and we shouldn't create these artificial boundaries between us. But we need to do this fast. We need to do it really, we need to do it now, we need to do it yesterday. And we need to do it with the public. We can't do it to the public. The public are such a key stakeholder in this. And more than a stakeholder, it's their climate emergency, and we are merely supporting a complete change in how we have to do business as countries, as communities, as cities. But we always need to be agile because things are changing just so quickly. Really, it's very difficult to try and bring together 45 minutes of conversation, but I hope that gives it a slight insight into some of the key things that I've been hearing. I would just like to thank both of you. Clearly, very, very knowledgeable about this topic, bringing such interesting examples from all over the world, Vancouver, and then all of the different contexts that BRCAC is working in. I'd just like to close things by thanking you both so much for your time this morning, this evening, this afternoon, depending where you are, and thank the audience too for participating, for sharing your questions, for joining us this evening, and wish you all well for the rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Ruth as well.
Thank you.